We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Today we have the fabulous Edlyn, who's come back to talk to us today. And Emily, as you know, is a clinical psychologist specializing in children and families, and is passionate about translating parenting research for the rest of us. And she's also the fabulous co-host of Psychologist Off the Clock, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And she's written a wonderful book, Autonomy-supportive Parenting, Reduce Parental Burnout and Raise Competent, Confident Children. And just recently has published a new book. Like, when did it get published?
I just got my copy and it's not out until August. So this is hot off the presses.
That is fantastic. In your field, a journal to explore your emotions. And it looks really useful. Actually, we were just saying how it looks useful to adults, to be honest. The idea is it's the journal that children or adolescents will use to sort of learn about their feelings.
It's written for 8 to 12, and it is really kind of a tutorial on the science of emotions, like why we have all the different emotions we have, even ones that are hard to feel. And so each chapter is a different emotion. And then within those chapters are activities to both understand the emotion and practice healthy coping.
Oh, that sounds really helpful. In fact,
it was really fun. Yeah.
Yes, really. I'll try and get hold of a copy. They usually come a bit later to Singapore, but yes, congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really.
And thanks for the repeat invite. I feel so
I
honored.
know. Yes, it's so fun. So today we have a particularly interesting topic close to everybody's heart. So the topic is parents matter, but do they make a difference? It's a bit controversial, I would say, but a really important topic to be discussing, to think about what is the real impact that parents can have in our children's development and our children's lives. So yeah, perhaps we can kick off with why this is an important conversation. Why do you think we should be having this conversation, Emily?
Well, from my standpoint, where I talk and write a lot about the risks and downsides of intensive parenting, which has become the really dominant parenting style of being heavily involved in every aspect of our children's lives. I think bringing up this question is a positive in the sense of getting some perspective on how much does all that involvement really change a child's trajectory, and how much is it actually making a difference? Because it takes a ton of energy and attention. And again, I see a lot of the downsides, including parents kind of losing their core sense of self and identity because they're doing so much parenting and I call it hyper parenting. So I think it's a good question to really look at what do we know from the science and how can we examine the influence of parents on child development?
Absolutely. And yes, and hopefully have some answers so that we can regulate our parenting behaviors a little bit. Because I do think, there's been, I don't know how many books, last time I looked, written on parenting in the last couple of decades, to be honest. There's been a real shift, perhaps in response to the parenting in the 60s, that has moved us into this very intensive and very intentional world of parenting. So yes, I'm really glad we are thinking about this and seeing what really is worth. We just had a conversation with Diana Hill, who used to be on Psychologist Off the Clock, about wise effort. And it feels really important to be thinking about, what really is going to make a difference when it comes to our parenting efforts. And Where is our energy well spent? So yeah, let's start having this conversation. Do you want to kick us off, Emily, just thinking about, so what do we know about the impact of parenting on outcomes?
That is a really big question. And I would say this isn't, I'm an academic by training, so I'm always really aware of what I don't know, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm high integrity around what I'm representing. So I'll say that, in my current work, I'm very much in the parenting universe of parent writing and parent guidance, but I'm not right now, I'm not like reading all the journal articles at this point. That was good enough in grad school. But I think, there has been this back and forth even between scientists around how much do parents matter. And I have seen the headlines in media, popular media, that's so click-worthy of parents don't matter. I think that gets everyone's attention. And despite the back and forth and this huge debate, as usual, I think the answer likely falls in the middle. I mean, these are both extreme sides. Parents don't matter, or they are the primary influence. And it depends. It's going to depend on a lot of factors. And of course, I wrote a book. I think what gets confusing as a psychologist too is when you're reading all these articles over decades about child outcomes. I wrote a whole book after reading dozens of articles about how parenting strategies specifically affect child outcomes. It's really hard to say parenting doesn't matter. It's a hard reconciling to make between, well, then are all these studies showing that this kind of parenting then leads to these outcomes? So I think that's where I get stuck. I'm curious where each of you fall in that.
I think it's an overly simplest question. I mean, it's kind of like when people ask the question, does psychotherapy work? It's like, well, what kind of psychotherapy? Delivered by whom? To whom? Under what circumstances? And I know Emily, talked about, the cultural differences. In Japan, lots of co-sleeping. The whole question of authoritative versus authoritarian parenting that's been going on for years and years. That depends on, your socioeconomic status and your cultural history. So I think when we try to reduce these things to simplest questions, it does generate more heat than light.
It is really, I was sort of, when we were thinking about this topic, I think it might be worth thinking about the sort of two camps and why we've had this debate more recently in response to what is the real impact of parenting. And of course, I agree, it can be oversimplistic, but it's also worth thinking a little bit about what we know are individual differences and what we know are influenced by, it's obviously the nurture-nature argument that makes things look really simple when it's much more complicated. But what is the genetic piece? What can we not influence through parenting? So what do we know? None of us are researchers. Let's just put that out there. And I don't know the research very deeply at all. But I am curious. So one of the debates, obviously side of the debates, is that really it's genetics that drives outcomes more than parenting. And it's quite a strong argument. Genetics does account for probably 50, if not more, 70%, how we do in life, how successful we are at school, our behavioral, some of our mental health issues. And so, can parents really influence those parts of us?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. Measures of self-control, going back to the marshmallow study, measures of self-control are twice as predictive of academic success than our IQ scores. And so whatever parents or the environment at large can do to help children develop self-control skills are obviously going to affect academic success. The other thing that I would just throw out here is the whole idea of epigenetics, which I I really, can't say I understand, but we're beginning to understand that the environment can affect gene expression. So you could have all kinds of genes for this or that, and the environment, including the parental part of that, will turn on or turn off certain of those genes, and you get the final common pathway, whatever that might be. So again, to say, is it genes or is it, the environment, that's blended in ways that we didn't appreciate even like 10 years ago.
Another finding I ran across that was really interesting to me was this idea that children act like their parents when they're home with their parents. But then outside in the community and in their non-home environments, they are behaving in different ways. And that was one of the arguments, that what we're seeing in terms of like parents seeing their children as similar to them is kind of an artifact of, or a bias of, well, they're behaving more like you around you. And I hadn't really thought of it that way, but it's kind of interesting because that brings in, again, the impact of a child's other environments besides the home and family, and how they're being shaped by their school environment, their community environment, their peer environment.
Well, along those lines, children tend to be better behaved outside the home than in the home. Mm-hmm. And how children behave outside the home is more predictive of their future than how they behave in the home, which is comforting news that I've often conveyed to parents. Probably in large part because kids are more regressed around their parents and are less likely to act in mature ways or try things out that they wouldn't dare try out, their teacher or their friend's parents, in terms of trying to get their needs met. These things are complicated.
I guess it gets me thinking. So, as we only think about this when we become parents, until we're parents, we don't really care too much about the influence parents can have on children. But it feels like a huge responsibility to become a parent, and that we carry this tremendous weight on how our kids will turn out. Like if our kids are rude, we feel responsible. If our kids don't do well in school, we feel responsible. If our kids aren't potty trained by 18 months, we feel responsible. It's all on us. So at least recently, it feels like it's all on us. I can't say that previous generations felt that sense of responsibility. And you can see the kind of evolution of the literature that has moved us to that, to this place we are in today, I think, where parenting feels heavy and anxiety-provoking and stressful.
It's a lot of pressure. I think it's a high pressure culture right now around parenting.
Yeah. Because, not just because we're worried about the safety of our children, a lot of that, but it's because we think we can make such a difference. And so thinking about how much the different choices that we make as parents can actually influence our kids, I think hopefully can help relieve some of that pressure. That's my hope out of our conversation today. Like we're going to sort out all these anxious parents out there in this conversation.
It's the anxious parents who are listening to this podcast. Sadly, there are parents out there who are not anxious, who do not feel responsible. And hopefully they're listening, but I would venture to guess that our demographic is the neurotic parent.
Yep. And you're absolutely right.
And I say that, with all kindness and respect.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're probably alluding to, is that, parenting matters mostly when parenting is done really badly, like when there's neglect. Parenting.
Well, I'll share that the beginning of my career, like even before graduate school, I worked in the child protection system and I worked in homes. So I was a home-based counselor. So 20 hours a week, I was sitting in families' homes who were under investigation for abuse or neglect. And I was part of the services for the family. And so, I was really young. I was early 20s, so well before I became a parent myself. But it really gave me huge perspective on what new parents were worrying about with their kids. And I'm thinking, you are not harming your child by taking a shower while the baby is fussing. They're fine. I just had this bigger, you are actually feeding your child when your child's hungry, and there's just these basics that absolutely have to be in place. And most parents who are listening to these podcasts and reading the parenting books are doing those things and aren't at risk for child abuse or neglect.
And you're right. The people who attend the parenting courses, the people who read the books, who do the audiobooks and lectures, are all the ones that are doing a good enough job.
Yeah.
And are all the ones that are stressing about whether they are doing a good enough job.
Yeah, they're the ones that do need the message that we may matter less than we think we do. And that could help relieve the pressure.
Years ago, Stanley Turecki, who wrote The Difficult Child, he came to Seattle and gave a lecture at the University of Washington. I was at Children's Hospital at the time, and for some reason I got picked to introduce him. So introduced him to this 2,000 people in this lecture hall at the university on a rainy Tuesday night. And he got up and he said, "You all are the best educated, most well-informed generation of parents in human history, and you're the most neurotic." He said, "Relax." He said, relax, by virtue of you all being here on a rainy Tuesday night, you're good parents. And you could just feel the energy in the room. But it's true. I mean, we just make ourselves crazy with these questions. And am I doing it right? And there are 60,000 parenting books out there. The last time Emma, you and I looked it up, and there are probably quite a few more since that's only been about 18 months. So it's I think the people who are caring the most probably need to relax, and the people who aren't caring probably need to step it up. And how do we reach those people? Right. Obviously, Emily, you were doing that, when you were doing that early work, and hopefully other people are doing that now. I'm sure they are, but probably not enough.
Well, and what I learned from that work was the heavy impact of generational trauma and poverty. And it was just such a different world. And you're right. It's important that we figure out culturally, collectively, how to better meet the needs of those families who have long suffered and don't have the resources, both internally and concretely, to raise children in healthier ways. But I think it brings up the matter of perspective. When we even say, do we matter? Do parents matter? For what? What does it mean? What does it mean to raise a what kind of child? How are we even defining that?
It's a great question. I was thinking about that before we came on, because I think our expectations are not, I guess the bottom line is a happy child, a child that's living as full a life as they can with all the opportunities that they want out of life. And that's a big socioeconomic piece.
And I would also even question what is happy. I think it's...
Yeah, you're right.
Happiness is nice, but...
it's fleeting.
It is.
It's fleeting.
Yeah.
And I think what we need to think about as parents is, what do we really want for our children? And when we think about the impact of parenting, absolutely, what are we thinking that we're going to be able to impact?
And I'll just share too, that I have friends and families I've worked with where the parents are very loving and attentive, and maybe even not that neurotic. And they have children who struggle with various illnesses or disorders, and they're not to blame. And I think that the cultural message is that somehow if our child has those struggles, that we did something wrong. There was a recent, I won't name names, but there's a recent best-selling book that proposes, and it's all theory because there's no science in my mind to back this up, that ADHD is due to child trauma or infant trauma. And I'm thinking that is just laying on unnecessary guilt for all these parents who have children with ADHD, who are very loving, nurturing parents. And now there's this message that somehow there was a trauma that caused the ADHD.
Heartbreaking.
Almost hot right now.
Yeah.
It's the answer for everything.
Trauma, I agreed. And I think
It'll pass.
it'll be something else. Hopefully
It'll be something else.
being
Sorry
on
for all the traumatized people out there that I just offended, but come on.
Yeah. I think, and just thinking about what you said, Emily, the piece that, there has been so much responsibility laid at the feet of parents, a lot of mothers mostly. Like if we think of some of the psychoanalytic theories, we talked about one just before we came on, which I have to mention because it's just too good, that Freud apparently said that asthma developed in children as a result of having overheard the parents having sex, and the panting being as a result of the kid mimicking the sound that they heard. And that's just obviously a ridiculous statement. But, there's been more harmful theories like the refrigerator mother by Leo Kanner regarding why children develop autism or schizophrenia. So very much at the feet of mothers, mostly mothers, and their behaviors. So there's been a very damaging history for parents, really, and their responsibility for the outcomes. And like you said, with these families, I've worked with incredible families who have had children that were really suffering and suffered, of course, tremendously as a result, but it having not been their fault as such. They didn't do anything wrong. And I think parents need to be liberated from some of this narrative that they make mistakes, and mistakes, whatever they might be, from not showing up at someone's football match to, forgetting the lunchbox or something, as being sort of grave signs of neglect. I think things have gotten out of hand.
I just had this thought about the impact of pseudoscience and how, influencers have this huge platform now with social media to impart pseudoscience that's really dangerous, including, we can't ignore, the anti-vaccine movement. And that, again, is a parenting choice, whether to get your child vaccinated. And there's huge fear mongering out there about that is not based in science about the risks of vaccinating your children. So I think I just want to put that out there as part of the culture we're parenting in, that we're just surrounded by these messages. It's really hard to tease apart what's true and what's not. And it's, again, putting a lot of responsibility on parents.
I think it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I was just thinking how, taking responsibility off parents in terms of outcomes, these radical outcomes like children having, because I do think, we can influence our children's outcomes if, we're neglectful, we're abusive, we do a really harmful job. Yes, of course. Or we bring up, our children in incredible deprivation, not for any fault of our own, that will have an impact. Or, we know that the impact of postnatal depression and whether that's a genetic piece or not. So we know that there are pieces of our behavior that will influence the outcomes of our kids. But we just need to potentially also, so I think it feels liberating to think that we don't have as much control over the outcomes, but I wonder if that creates anxiety too. Like, if we can't influence, then what? If we can't make a difference, then what?
Yes. And I think that's why this question keeps coming up because some people like one answer and some people like another answer. But I think I'll just throw out there, yes, child abuse and neglect harms children. There's just no question. I mean, it actually changes their brain wiring. So we know it's harmful. I wonder also, however, if this anxious parenting becomes harmful in the way that it interferes with a child's development. So it's like we get in the way of what our children need to do their own growth and development because we're trying to protect them so much. So that's something that I sort of just see happening. And in my work in autonomy-supportive parenting, that's one of the big fundamental theories, is that if we're not giving our child more autonomy, they're not gaining mastery and their own sense of autonomy to live a healthier, happier life. So I think that's something just to think about for those neurotic, anxious parents, and I am included in that group of, do we ever have to watch us how we might get in the way? And for example, my oldest, I'm very school oriented, high achievement. School is very important to me, always excelled in school. And it kind of shocked me. My kids weren't wanting to do the exact same thing I did. But my oldest is now about to graduate 8th grade. And in 6th grade, she could care less about school. And we had to sort of, encourage her to at least do her work. And we didn't focus on grades, but do your work and you just show up. This year, and not that it's about the grades, but this is what it represents. She just earned her first 4.0, and she's incredibly proud of herself. And I watched her start to enjoy learning more. Like it became a more internally motivated process for her. And I shared this story recently on a podcast, and I kind of made the joke that, but I probably had nothing to do with it. And the podcast host said, yeah, you probably didn't. And I said, well, but I think I could have if I kept up high pressure on, you need to get all A's, you're grounded if you don't get all A's. And, if I would have kept up the external pressure, I don't know she would have found that internal motivation.
Mm. And I mean, we could argue that you do have a lot to do with it genetically.
True. Right. Like maybe she's predisposed if I just let her find her way with that. Yeah.
Like
also, focusing on the grades, by the time the grades come out, it's too late. But by focusing on showing up, doing the work, the day-to-day processes that are involved, then the grades take care of themselves. And at a certain point, maybe not a person recognizes that, hey, this is kind of interesting, and they have the motivation to begin on their own. But yeah, I think if you had emphasized grades, it wouldn't have worked as well. So you had that influence by choosing what you were going to emphasize.
And I guess that sort of reminds me that we know that parenting interventions help with anxiety. Anxious kids can be really well supported by parental intervention in terms of actually backing off and giving children opportunities to take risk. And so we know we can help children when they're struggling. And with ADHD and behavioral issues, we know that parenting interventions really do help. So we can have influence, but perhaps the emphasis being mostly on when kids are struggling.
The question, is there a problem?
Yeah.
Because what I see parents is they're just in this like constant go, and worry. And I ask, but where's the problem?
Right. Yeah. He's getting an A-. Okay.
Yeah.
I had a pretty high-end clientele here in Seattle, and I watched Seattle change over the last 10 years in terms of high tech and a lot of people coming in and a lot more pressure on kids. And yeah, the problems that parents were bringing to me were, beyond first world problems. Or like C-suite issues. And the child's like 8. Yeah, is there a problem?
And maybe that's a good question, because parents can create a problem, but the problem might be that the kid isn't the way the parents want them to be.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that isn't really a problem with the kid. It's more a problem with the parent and their expectations.
As I was thinking through these questions in preparation for today, one place I landed was focusing more on what kind of relationship do I want to nurture with my child, rather than being so focused on this is the kind of child I should be raising or need to raise. And I just wonder about the shift around, how am I relating to my child? Like, how do we feel in our connection together, rather than what kind of child am I going to end up raising and having that pressure? Because I think the relationship focus does allow for more of the freedom of your child to develop into who their real self is, without these expectations that can be a mismatch. And I know in my work, and I know you've seen it, Chris, when there's that mismatch between parental expectations and a child's sense of identity, there's a lot of suffering for that child.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of conflict. And if the relationship isn't good, then if the child does start to get into some trouble, they don't have a home base to go back to and reconnect and maybe, reset. So yeah, for me, it's the relationship is everything. And I've counseled many parents not dying on the altar of homework or killing the relationship on the altar of homework. It's not a sacrifice you want to be making.
Or these days, cell phones. Media, like technology, is becoming the hill that the relationships are dying on, from what I've seen.
Yeah, and it's tricky, because you've got all kinds of stuff that's coming into the child's life through the phone or the computer that parents should be monitoring and, maybe, censoring. And but you're up against the child's culture and, the whole TikTok thing. It's my wife and I often think, we're very grateful that we had our child when we did, because he's 30 now and he missed out on a lot of this stuff that's around the last 10, 15 years, which I'm not sure I would have known how to handle very well.
And so in a way, parenting shouldn't be a means to an end.
Parenting really should be a relationship, not a verb.
Right. And I think that's when it gets hard, when we're trying to change them. There was that book.
Yeah.
Wasn't it The Carpenter versus the Gardener? And it has a lot about genetics. It kind of lost me. But I like that idea that, what kind of parent do we want to be? Are we going to be allowing that sort of genetic flow, as the geneticists like to say, allowing the child to be who they are, who they're going to be, and sort of make sure that they have the needs met to be able to, become whatever the garden that they will be, versus the carpenter that's kind of forcing them into being something that perhaps they're not going to be, or they're not meant to be, or that we can't influence. Yeah. And I guess the sort of backdrop is this sense of responsibility for their outcomes means that we are very invested in their outcomes because of what it can potentially say about us.
Which then adds so much pressure to the child.
Yeah, true. Yes, isn't it? It adds pressure to the child. Yeah.
And I'll just bring up youth sports as another example. There's so much pressure these days compared to even, I think, 10, 15 years ago of athleticism, and being a star athlete to be considered worthy and successful And there's a lot. I mean, I'm seeing young kids do these crazy, like flying to Europe to do a training clinic, at 8 years old. It's really a different world too, that I think we need to really be paying attention to the pressure that it communicates to children and that we're becoming part of, even with good intentions.
Yeah. Carl Jung said, the greatest influence on the life of a child is the life his parent never led.
Wow.
Yep. I've heard that's a good one. See, you always come up with the quotes, Chris.
Yeah. It's so true. It's so true. I was just thinking recently that one of the hardest emotions that I struggle with is witnessing disappointment, my children's disappointment. I really find that very hard. I find it hard to see them disappointed. And I'm thinking about, why do I find it hard to see them disappointed? Why can't, rationally, I think disappointment is so important. But I think because I feel responsible that they're not, getting whatever it is that they think. And I'm thinking of it particularly with I have a son who's very invested in his football and would go to a clinic in Europe. Age date.
Oh, mine would too if he were invited. So
Yeah.
I'm not shaming it. I'm just like, but it's out there,
I know. And it creates, I think I find it very difficult to navigate. And I feel he gets huge disappointment if he doesn't play as well as he wanted, or he doesn't get picked for the starting lineup, or, he's sick and therefore he doesn't get picked to play the majority. That weight. It just, and I, as a parent, I think, oh no, I find it really hard to see him disappointed. Like I should have been able to avoid it somehow. I don't know how, but somehow I should make it better. My husband's much better than me at sitting with disappointment. I find I this urge to sort of rescue him somehow comes out. So I think it is hard as parents to sit with their difficult feelings because we do take responsibility for it, even though their feelings probably, have multiple reasons, sometimes nothing to do with us. Even when they tell us it's got something to do with us, it probably doesn't have anything to do with us. We're just the first person they saw whilst they were feeling angry. And suddenly it's our...
And we're the safest. And that's a good sign, right? That we are that safe space to let it all out when they need to let it all out. Within limits. They can't just, cuss us out. But
I resent being the safe space. Sometimes
it's a lot of work.
And there is data that shows that, mothers get the hard end of the stick, right? And mothers, I remember, when I used to do a lot more assessments, mothers always rate children as worst behaved, stronger tantrums. And everyone's going, oh yeah, well, that's the mother's rating. Let's look at everybody else. We know mothers. And I'm thinking, no, we know mothers are really feeling this. I know they are. They're rating their experience because it is bigger experience.
Well, they're getting it.
They're getting it. I know. But I remember the feeling of, oh, it's mom rating. This is pre-kids. Of course, we know moms always sort of embellish and make it all bigger. But until I became a parent and I recognized no embellishing, really is, it's hard. Yeah. What do we do as a parent to do, given that our influence is probably, given the people who are listening, anybody that's listening to
Right. This audience, this demographic is likely over-interpreting their level of influence. And I think it would be an interesting exercise for parents to, if something happens with their child and they feel that, say, surge of anxiety or discomfort or needing to do something about it, to check in with, why am I feeling that impulse? We worry about our children's well-being, but in a way that overreaches. And so I think building the awareness, I have some of my kids, I have 3, so I won't name names, but have very big emotions and it's very intense. And I want to stop it sometimes because it's so big and hard to manage and be with. But I've learned what gets my discomfort, like you were talking about, Emma, is that I worry they're just not going to be okay. Like that is the underlying worry is what if they don't come out of this? What if they're really not going to be okay? And that gets my anxiety really ramped up. But then even having that awareness helps me take a step back and remember and put context. This is life has challenges. This is them learning how to respond to a challenge. And I need to let them learn. And so I think it's increasing that awareness in the moment and doing some checks throughout those uncomfortable parenting moments of why am I anxious? Is there an actual problem? And what am I worried about? What's my fear here?
And okay, when?
What does that even mean? Yeah.
Well, I would hate to have my life, signed by my 20s. It was not pretty. I flunked out of university. I was a janitor for a while, sleeping on my soon-to-be brother-in-law's couch. It was not pretty. And I'm sure I put my parents through all kinds of, worries. But, life got me, going at a certain point. But yeah, I was certainly not fully formed by the time I left my parents' house and had lots of experiences to go before I became a reasonably responsible adult. And, thankfully my wife, shores the parts of me that aren't. But yeah, when it's a lifelong journey for most people and parents are only there for a certain portion of it in terms of day-to-day influence.
I wonder if there are any sort of mantras or affirmations that would help, right? Like being able to say, this isn't about me, or this is my child's path, or, along those lines, of separating from that investment that I have all of this control or influence. Do you have ideas? I'm curious.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. I'm just one of many influences on the life of my child. And it's parenting is a process of starting to relinquish those influences and allowing other influences to step in, whether it's the kindergarten teacher on through their first boss at the fast food restaurant that, they're working at.
And I guess that's the scary part.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have to relinquish control.
And maintain the relationship. We don't relinquish the relationship.
Right. Yeah. And I want to, I think where it can be a little fuzzy is, the whole permissive parenting too, which is that approach of very few limits. There's a lot of warmth, but there's very few limits and rules and structure. And some of this, if we're oh, well, we don't have influence, so it doesn't matter what we do. That's not quite it either, right?
We're not going to neglect just because, we know that if you are doing well as a family, socioeconomically, academically, then your kid is going to be okay. But that doesn't mean we stop sending them to school.
Exactly. Right.
And it's going to depend. It's, you each have 3 children, they're probably all quite different. I know, I've heard Emma talk about how, different her children are. So it kind of depends. What does this child need, as opposed to this child? And then they change on you. They go from being a toddler to, school age kid to an adolescent to a young adult, and you have to adjust accordingly.
Yeah. And as we're talking about, the relationship goes through changes as well. And I think we need to normalize that. And I happen to have my 12-year-old as my middle child. And so I've done this once with her older sister. And I'm realizing for these two, this 11 to 13 age is a huge transformation of how they're connecting with me or not, where they need differentiate from me a lot. So there's a lot more pushing me away. But that doesn't have. So I think the relationship is going to change too. And we need to be open to that and understanding and kind of go with the flow of that as the best we can.
Yeah, because I guess when I'm thinking about relationship, we can get a bit confused as parents. What does a parenting relationship look like? And it's not about being our kid's friend. And it's not about them always being happy. It's actually having a relationship where you set boundaries, you say no, you say, I didn't like this, you say, I did like this, and I think you're fabulous. It's all of it. And that being a really important piece to their development, I think. Maybe not in terms of, I think in terms of outcomes, because, they learn about relationships with us. How to do
I think it's establishing guardrails, where, it's guidance as opposed to, micromanaging.
Yeah, we're not the cruise director.
Right. It's providing feedback. I used to tell my son, I'm representing society at this moment. If what you're doing is annoying me, it's probably going to annoy other people. And, he'd roll his eyes. I'm just like, oh God, parents for psychologists, I'm doomed, but it's true, I'm representing society here, and I don't think I'm unusual in how I'm responding to your behavior at the moment.
Yeah, and I've had the whole my body, my choice for everything, my life, my choice, there's that. And I say, well, I have the fully developed adult brain. Yeah. So, and I am in your role as parent. So yeah, I need to help find some limits here to your life, your choice. It's not all your choice.
Yeah.
For your own well-being.
Great advocate.
For your own good.
It's really wonderful to be talking about parenting in this way. I found the conversation really quite liberating, and I felt quite validated because I can trip over myself as a parent and start worrying if I forgot to pick up my child. They will then have to bring it up in therapy in 20 years' time. Or maybe
they have to have something to bring up, right?
Maybe it's something else I didn't even know had happened, which is more likely. And accept that, things are influencing my kids that are beyond my control. They will develop into their little, not so little beings. And I will do the best I can to have a relationship where I can love them for who they are, even when I don't like them. Because there are times when we don't. And they don't like us.
And that's okay. That's okay. It's part of growing up.
It really is. So thank you. Anything else?
I think our final answer to this question is it depends.
Oh no. But yeah.
Which is not the best-selling answer, unfortunately, because it does not provide certainty. But I'm hopeful that people listening to this can come away with perspective and more context and kind of let themselves off the hook for, not just don't sweat the small stuff is kind of my take home too. Don't sweat the small stuff and just focus on the bigger picture.
Yes. And I think also all these different models of parenting, like attachment parenting, detachment parenting, reattachment, I don't know, all of these different models. But there are so many and they're so short-lived because the reality is that they probably don't make that big a difference. That's why we seem to sort of come up with more. And, I would like to sort of liberate parents into, trying to enjoy the ride a bit more and not get so entangled with their worries about outcomes and are they doing a good enough job? And I think I wouldn't want to say it, but I think by definition, if they're worrying about it, they're probably doing a good enough job.
Right. And the emphasis is on good enough.
Which includes our kids not liking us and our kids getting angry with us and our kids telling us we're not doing a good enough job. Mm-hmm. All of that still makes it a good enough job. As hard as it is. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Emily. This was a delight.
Thank you so much.
And
thanks for making this happen. I appreciate you.
very much.
Congratulations on the new book.
Oh, I know. I'm sitting here thinking, and I wrote a parenting book too.
Yeah.
I'm part of the problem. Yeah.
Yes, we are.
But I will say,
but honors are going to make a difference.
Yes, this conversation will help everyone. But really, though, in my book, I make an effort to have it be very flexible, more of an approach and mindset than an actual do this, don't do that. So I'm hoping I'm straddling the line a little bit where there's more of an expansiveness to it than a prescription.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.